What I love about each episode, it's just raw, it's fresh, it's innovative. Speaking of innovation, I can't wait until we unveil our latest pedagogical method when it comes to teaching people what's up. And that is essentially that we're not here to instruct, we're here to inspire. And really, our own culture, we say history, science, culture. The fourth word unspoken would be inspiration. Fitspiration.
Yeah, I mean, I think any podcast you're on is automatically inspiring.
When we set the bar that low, anything could be inspirational. And let me just say that being a part of this right here, the cult, of Iron Culture has been exceptionally rewarding. This is now episode 40. We've been doing it for approximately 10 months and getting to know you a little bit better and hopefully other people getting to know Eric. And here's what people don't understand. Eric has his professional demeanor, and it's absolutely necessary because that's who Eric is. Eric is a consummate professional, period, full stop. And it's one of the things I like a lot about you. Eric's also very funny. And there's a certain level of decorum when he conducts himself and how he carries himself when he's presenting, that he wants to make sure that he's carrying himself in such a way that the information is what's important. But Eric could be very funny. And I knew that actually from last year when we met up and we did the Kaizen project. One, I was impressed. I had a host of individuals that would come on the channel, both professionals and also just fellow YouTubers that would talk in front of the camera. And you were at the tippity top, Eric, for your ability to communicate. And
the tippity
top, not just the
tippity top.
The tippity top.
Yeah, that's quite the kippity compliment.
Mm-hmm. I take back that statement about you being funny.
As I tumble down from the tippity top, hitting every riggedy rock on the wiggity way down.
As they say, Eric, there's only one way to go when you're at the top, and you just eloquently demonstrated that.
That's what I'm here for.
Now, he did an exceptional job actually with the videos, but getting to know you, honestly, on a personal basis, finding out how funny that you can be, I knew immediately that the rapport would carry the information through. And so I've been grateful to do Iron Culture with you and also to dig deeper within myself through Iron Culture, through doing all these episodes, into the whys, why we lift. And I could say that 2019 has been personally for me one of the best years of my lifting career as a result of that. So just giving a little shout out and a thank you to the community, to Eric, to everything to Draperism.
Draperism, yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to give it right back to you, buddy, because this has been really meaningful to me as well. And 2019 has been, I would say for me, almost too successful.
Right.
Because I haven't had enough time to stop and smell the roses or connect with the people when I see them because of the travel I've done or appreciate what's been done. I mean, I have gone hard in the Iron Culture myself. Starting a new podcast, competing in bodybuilding, starting in strongman, and taking on students who are starting their career here at AUT and mentoring them. A lot has happened this year. 10-year anniversary of 3DMJ, 40th episode. Hopefully, we're both correct that this will actually be episode 40. I think there's a strong possibility it won't be. It'll be like 39 or 41 or 42.
Imagine
and that'll
like
just
63.
Be hilarious.
We just forget about this episode.
Wow, like way far off, yeah. Oh shit, where's that duo episode? So, yeah, I almost hope this is not episode 40, just so everyone listening gets a taste of what it's like to be Iron Culture, But anyway, yeah, two-way street, as you like to say, mutual appreciation society.
Yeah.
So, the other mass.
Yeah.
But I guess only one S, it's like Maz. French.
Well, it's like Moss Wrestling. Shout out to the other culture, right?
Oh, yeah, I love it.
I got it, bro. Yeah. I'm on it. Chip Comrade.
Connections.
One of my favorite episodes. And that's why I want to say that for those listening, and we read the feedback and thoroughly appreciative of everyone's statement, that essentially this is two friends bonding over the Iron Culture, talking about it, trying to give practical, useful information. Sometimes we could be irreverent. Okay, sometimes we might make inappropriate statements or appropriate depending upon what side you're on. But the goal, as always, is to get into the philosophical underpinnings of why we lift and then how to better lift. And I think this episode today will be one of those more practical, useful episodes where we talk about training frequency. And I think we could say, Eric, this is a little bit of science applied. There will be some science in this episode. Can we put hashtag science before the episode title? Do I have permission?
Well, hey, look, if if any episode you're on is inspirational,
Yeah.
any episode I'm on is automatically science.
Yeah.
I've learned this from some of the comments that if I speak, it is evidence, and I'm going to fully embrace that.
Yeah.
I've decided today to stop reading science because who needs to when you are the science embodied?
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Bill Nye who? Miss Frizzle what? Neil grabbing asses Tyson? No, thank you. Okay. Eric's like, I don't stand behind that. Look, that
as a reminder to everyone listening, the statements of Omar Isuf and Eric Helms do not represent Omar Isuf and Eric Helms as representatives of Iron Culture. They stand alone and are not indicative of the official beliefs of the culture. Shout out Draper and Paimon.
Oh man. But in all seriousness, I think having a conversation about training frequency, both as a coach and an evidence-based professional, would be illuminating. And so let me serve as the conduit here, Eric, to ask and frame some of the questions, and we could get right down to it. I think the first question would be a definition as to what training frequency is, or what is this important variable. When people will typically talk about volume as it relates to bodybuilding, they'll talk about intensity as it relates to strength. Not that those are the only variables you should consider, but those are the big variables. But interesting enough, I would make the argument that frequency kind of dances back and forth between the two, because frequency is important both for strength and hypertrophy. So what is training frequency, or what is this important variable when we discuss training?
Yeah, frequency is something that in general I like to put forth as, while it's intrinsically tied, like you hinted at, to volume and intensity, it probably shouldn't be put on the same level, but it kind of sort of has to be. Because as you manipulate volume and intensity, you often are required to manipulate frequency. And it's such a game breaker, or deal breaker, I should say, for people, because it's also tied to their schedule and adherence. So there's two ways to look at frequency. You can look at the number of times you actually step into the gym, which, hell, you can look. Powerlifting is a cool example of, we have world champions who literally train just twice per week, all the way up to people who train every day, and sometimes have gone on periods where they train multiple times per day. And so on one hand, you could look at that and say, hey, why does frequency matter at all? But on the other hand, you say, oh, it's something that is highly customizable to the individual, and maybe it's something to focus on. So yeah, I think frequency, as we're going to probably primarily discuss it today, is going to be related to body part or movement frequency per week, just as a nice way to put some constraints on it. So we can actually have something we can talk about without being too up in the clouds, amorphous.
And I guess then, launching right off of that, can you tell us what the evidence currently shows, what the data available shows as it relates to frequency? I saw Greg Knuckles had those articles going over frequency as it relates to strength, so movements and trying to get stronger, that showed, I believe, versus training 1 to 2 times a week, training 3 times or more, seemed in the studies over the 12-week period to elicit greater strength gains. And then when it comes to hypertrophy, so can you just delve into what the current data shows, or what we understand?
Sure. So Iron Culture, we're a cult, but we have a pantheon of gods that we pray to.
Right.
There are strong men and women. There are powerlifters. There's weightlifters. There's bodybuilders. And then people fall on both the competitive and the non-competitive side of that. So we're going to talk about not only how frequency impacts hypertrophy, which is the best of all trophies, that hypertrophy, and also we're going to talk about strength, which can be applied to many different lifts, and always expressed through a lift. So when we look at the aggregate data, we've got a lot to play with. So I would say since 2016, we've had a bit of a renaissance of meta-analyses coming out and studies on frequency. And if we look just at the peer-reviewed data and these isolated meta-analyses, as a reminder, a meta-analysis is a study of studies. It's a conglomerate of all the peer-reviewed research trials on a given topic, collated together with inclusion and exclusion criteria to ensure there's not too much heterogeneity. Here we're all about the homogeneity. And then we're going to be looking at the outcomes to see whether it favors higher or lower frequencies. And looking at the purely published data, I would say overall, when doing a qualitative meta-analysis of these quantitative meta-analyses ad hoc here on Iron Culture Live on episode 40, that may be 39 or 41, you could say that there's a clear advantage of doing more than a 1 times per week frequency probably for hypertrophy and potentially for strength. And then that's when you have volume matched. So if we were comparing the same amount of volume, so let's say you compared someone doing 6x5 on only Monday on a lift versus someone doing a Monday, Friday 3x5, or someone doing, say, 10x10 for hypertrophy on Monday, or doing 5x10 on Monday and Friday. Typically, even though it's the same amount of volume, hypertrophy is going to be a little better once you get around to 2 times per week. After that, the data becomes much less clear for volume matched. However, seems to be a clear advantage for doing higher volumes with higher frequencies, as one can be a vehicle for the other. And there's a smattering of studies where you see similar volumes, if you're going to compare across studies, producing less hypertrophy or strength when you have to do it all in one day. And there's a robust amount of literature where you look at 2-a-days in some strength athletes that shows better outcomes, kind of showing that basically there is a threshold where you're doing too much in any given workout to where the quality goes down, and therefore the long-term adaptations would go down. So that's the peer-reviewed literature. But if you want to branch out, if you want to not just pray at the ivory tower of us #science folks, and if you want to look into the deep corners of the dark science web where folks like James Krieger and Greg Nuckols do the dirty work, that's when we can take a look at a broader data set. So Greg and James kind of have... So James, in his Weightology review, which I highly recommend, even though it directly competes with mass, that's just how badass it is. I'm fine just taking money out of my own pocket to deposit knowledge into your brain. That's
Eric, quick question, my friend. Between Salazar and Mozart, their eternal rivalry, who's who? Are you the young prodigy? Is Mass the young prodigy? Or are you is Mass the seasoned, elders that are looking with disdain at James Krieger rising through the ranks with Weightology once again lurking in the shadows to present interesting takes on information?
Yeah, it's got to be the other way around, because even though James Krieger looks like he's 21,
right,
he's not. And I'm not going to name his age on here because I don't want to disrespect my elder. But let's just say
he's your elder.
He is my elder,
right? Yeah. Oh, so you're Mozart? Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, figured out. Yeah. So anyway, James been around for a long time doing the damn thing. Statistically inclined. Greg also statistically inclined. Slight differences in their takes, which is always interesting, but very similar broad conclusions. So in Greg's articles on hypertrophy and strength, looking at the kind of this ad hoc meta-analysis where he included all the studies and had a broader inclusion criteria to make sure he had a broader look at the data. In general, for strength, it seems that, now remember, as I said, strength is always expressed through a movement, and often in research we're doing things like leg press, squat, bench press. Interestingly enough, the bench press seems to be more responsive to frequency than the squat. So there does seem to be association independent of volume, to where if you increase frequency on the bench press, it seems to be an effective way of increasing it. And then there is a small, very small effect size with hypertrophy, to where increasing frequency past that 2 times per week does seem to aid hypertrophy. James Krieger's take is a little different, and in general, it's right around, like you kind of posed it, right around that point where you hit the 2 to 3 times per week for hypertrophy. Do you see an advantage? And after that, if there is an advantage, it's quite small, and it largely is for organizing higher volumes. So on the whole, volume intensity, the much bigger variables that are going to influence both strength and hypertrophy respectively, meaning that volume is a little more potent as a hypertrophy stimulus, strength is a more potent stimulus, intensity is a more potent stimulus for strength, and then frequency, the way I like to propose it should be viewed, is as an organizational tool and as kind of a valve that you would release some pressure on when any given day becomes too high in volume. But it allows for much individualization, customization, and variation in application of volume intensity based on the individual needs of the individual.
You are just slamming this one out. This might be the first podcast episode, I'm joking, that's less than an hour, because it's not. There's so many questions still to dive into. I think that was a thorough explanation. And it's nice to hear the science confirms what artists have already known. The great neoclassical shred guitarist Yngwie Malmsteen infamously said, less is more? How could less be more? More is more. And that seems to be the general conclusion as it relates to frequency, I think I want to circle back a little bit because you said if you don't worship at the ivory tower of science, and we take a look at what has been preached for a long period of time, if we specifically talk first about body part training or hypertrophy, so more on the hypertrophy side, we'll typically see that bodybuilders would advocate doing a body part split or training with a lower overall frequency for those body parts and training at a higher intensity and higher amount of volume. What would you say the response would be, Eric, in light of some of this evidence that's coming out that seems to support maybe training a little bit more frequently? It's one of those variables you can manipulate. Intensity and volume is far more important. But the typical adage by a bodybuilder would be, oh, you want to get jacked from the 70s, 80s, 90s. At least if you read the muscle magazines or if you spoke, I actually remember, no joke, one of the largest dudes I've ever seen at the University of Windsor when he's lifting. And I just asked him questions because, of course, he's the big dog at the gym. And I remembered that he kind of parroted exactly that. You want to train at a high intensity, but you need to recover, so you can only train a body part once per week, was kind of the way he thought of things. So can you talk about that a little bit, Eric, why we see so many bodybuilders that will still typically advocate for a lower frequency approach, a lower frequency per body part, in spite of what seems to be coming out in the science community?
Yeah, so we're circling back, but only to circle forward.
Yeah.
Because as we know in Iron Culture, we discuss history, science, culture. So now we've discussed the science,
Yep.
and now we're going to discuss why perhaps the science seems to be at odds with history and culture. Actually, more so the culture, and then we'll bring in the history to explain that. So staying true to the three tenets, the three pillars of the cult, we're going to discuss that. So excellent question. I love that you use music to tie it in. I had no idea who you're talking about, but that is in the broad realm of culture, so it counts.
It was a subtle nod, Eric, that James Krieger, who you mentioned, it's one of his favorite guitarists. We both, like some metal in addition to other things. So I was just tipping my cap to Krieger.
Hey.
Your rival, bro. I'm sorry.
I would say my elder, But I mean that only from a pure perspective of him being wiser and more attuned to the beauty that is life, not like
A chronological. It's not chronological distinction.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure his testosterone's lower and he's generally closer to death, but that's not a knock. That's just the reality.
Yeah.
No big deal. Shout out James Krieger, old man. No, I'm just kidding. All right, so to answer your question,
Yep.
yes. We definitely see that currently, and we can use science again here. There was a systematic review of bodybuilders training in 2013, and 2/3 of them train with a 1 time per week body part split. 1/3 trains with a 2 times per week body part split, leaving no thirds remaining for a higher frequency than that. So what's the dealio if most bodybuilders are not at all training in the way that would be perhaps indicated to be ideal for hypertrophy? And that comes back to kind of the culture of bodybuilding, and exactly what that gentleman said at the University of Windsor to you, that look, hey, you got to train with a high intensity. And again, I don't think this individual meant intensity in terms of probably percentage of 1RM. They're probably more speaking of the kind of the ethos, the cultural ethos we see of intensity, meaning your sessions need to be hard.
Right.
Meaning that if you did a really, really high volume session and you were sweating and grunting and really barely getting through it because of the total work done, that would be considered a quote-unquote high-intensity session, even though it's a high-volume session. Likewise, if you took a Dorian-esque approach and you pushed everything to failure, needed a spotter, and used heavy loads in a low rep range, you did relatively low volume, but a very high perceived effort per set, proximity to failure, and then a high percentage of your 1RM. Both of those would be quote-unquote high-intensity. And those are the only two dominant styles of training that have been around in bodybuilding, I would say, for 40 years. And I think as bodybuilding has become more extreme and more hardcore culturally, and in terms of what you actually have to bring to the stage competitively, that has been echoed in the training regimens that people follow. And you can go all the way back to pumping iron and see this, that it's either high volume or it's high intensity, but never the twain shall meet, where you do something more moderate, which might allow a higher frequency. Because indeed, if you make a single session really, 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 really hard, it's going to make a greater recovery demand, which will, of course, impact frequency. So I think if you start with the non-negotiable stance of every session must be brutally difficult, subjectively experienced that way, it does force certain frequencies that is probably going to fall between training each muscle group once to twice per week. However, now if we tie in the history, if we go back to an era where there was no distinction between powerlifting, weightlifting, and bodybuilding, and powerlifting was simply the odd lifts that weightlifters used to supplement their weightlifting exercises, and that weightlifting and powerlifting competitions were often combined, and that basically most bodybuilders were weightlifters first, at least at this era, if we're talking about the early 1900s through the, say, 1930s, and then bodybuilders as a kind of a side effect, where function and form were seen as one and the same, and the focus was much more on improving strength and seeing the physique change as a response to that. There was less of this kind of built-in masochism and more of kind of a purity of focus. Also, because there was not yet the World Wide Web, and there was not a global kind of culture of bodybuilding. You would hang out in York Barbell, and there would be a definite feel there, and that got transposed upon the global community once Strength and Health got popular, and once people started reading it. That was kind of the proto internet, if you will. That globalizes culture, or at least gives people access to it, would be the health, Strength and Health magazines and the other muscle magazines of the era. But there were many, many different communities which all were part of physical culture at the time. And some would, take different approaches or different ethos than others. And we saw like the early days where Weider started to promote the idea of just doing hypertrophy for hypertrophy's sake, and having bodybuilders who didn't have to compete in a weightlifting meet the day prior. That's when you started to get ideas of different ways of organizing things, and not just basing things around the compound lifts and the big lifts, and actually doing some machine work, etc. And this progressed and progressed and progressed until we had the Nautilus movement come out, which coincided with the HIIT movement. So we had, a focus on machines and the idea of isolation work being superior. And we had the emergence of anabolic steroids all at the same time. So we had people taking performance-enhancing drugs, using isolation machines, and the rise of a very low-volume, high-intensity approach all coming out at the same time, which I think very much muddied the water of anecdotes to where almost everything worked. And we had these two dominant camps. And we're also seeing the rise of bodybuilding as a unique cultural identity right around this time as well. And that's where kind of that masochism grew. And I think this is totally my hypothetical, like on the fly hypothesis culturally that I've thought about a lot, but I can't say is necessarily true. I think that's why we've seen these two dominant styles of training, either high intensity or high volume, which both prevent people from really approaching training with a higher frequency approach. However, if you look outside of bodybuilding and the strength athlete community in general, if you just did a deadlift, guess what? That was a full body session. You pretty much didn't train like anterior delts and chest, and that's about it.
Yeah.
If you are doing an Olympic lift, boom, that's pretty much full body. So Olympic lifters training at the intermediate level on average 6 to 8 times a week, and at the high level multiple times per day. And powerlifters who will be squatting, a very common split for powerlifting these days would be squatting 2 to 3 times per week, benching 2 to 3 times per week, and deadlifting 1 to 2 times per week. That's obviously a high frequency approach, and then doing accessory work split up between it. And then if you look at the strength and conditioning community, they don't really think in terms of body parts being trained. They just think of what movements am I recovered, where should I put it, and what other demands do I have from the skill training, aerobic training, anaerobic training. So it's pretty much just this island where bodybuilders live alone, where they think that for some reason you can't train a muscle group more than once, maybe twice a week, or maybe 3 to 5 days at most, to where it'll then impede recovery, while everyone else in the world is not really concerned if their back got hit yesterday.
Right.
And more so think about it in a holistic manner.
What an apt analogy, I must say, Eric, eloquently put, that bodybuilders are on an island on their own, which kind of just really illustrates that masochism, the isolation, the identity that one is striving towards. I do want you to comment right now a little bit on the influence of anabolic steroids. Not that that's what this podcast is about. But when you said the weeder, all these things coming together, and when we had Dom on, it was a fascinating conversation about the weeder years and how it changed things. You're absolutely right. Where, Mr. America, Muscletown USA, all those books, Muscle, Smoke, and Mirrors, for those that are interested in the history of lifting, before, let's say, 1960, you basically would almost always be training for some sort of sport. So you had John Grimmick, right, with his insane overhead press, doing weightlifting, also competing in bodybuilding. And the two were connected. And then around the Weider time, training for hypertrophy's sake, the mass introduction of anabolic steroids. And then as the culture kind of morphed, there's so many things happening at the same time where it became more about trying to achieve a bigger and bigger physique and doing whatever it took. Can you just give a commentary, Eric, on maybe the effects of anabolic steroids as it relates to frequency or that volume and intensity approach, and maybe how it potentially, if anything, skewed due to having some of that survivorship bias? Who do we see emerging victorious always at these competitions now? Enhanced individuals. The role of the natural was heavily downplayed probably after, once again, I said 1960. That's not the actual cutoff, but just a rough approximation there. So the training methodology changed as the systems changed.
100%. And there's a number of ways that you can look at this. So the counter argument to everything I just said was, hey, specialization has resulted in the elevation of all sports, and it is more than just a population numbers game. It is more than just attributing it to anabolic steroids. Like, of course, it is a slight over-exaggeration to say that all records are falling all the time and sports are constantly getting better. That's a bit of a kind of a cultural meme that is only conditionally true. They actually just talked about this on Stronger by Science not too long ago. Greg brought it up, how there are a lot of sports, especially ones that are more dominated by strength and power, that have longstanding records from the 80s when there was widespread use of anabolics before there was actual drug testing. And we think now like, oh, of course, 2019, everyone's on more and better drugs, and that's actually just not the case. Like, and anyway, there are many examples of that I won't get into. Just go listen to Stronger by Science podcast if you want to listen to that.
The second fitness podcast ever.
The second one, I believe. I think that's their claim to fame.
Sorry, second most important. I sometimes get my words jumbled.
First fitness podcast, arguably not, and then second most important.
Thank you.
Beautiful. And I'm sure they would totally agree with that and not get annoyed. So, to go back to your question, one could say, hey, obviously, so bodybuilders started to specialize more. They're bigger, they're better. The Mr. Olympia, every 10 years could probably beat the previous Mr. Olympia of 10 years ago, or at least every 20 years. So clearly, if bodybuilders are moving towards lower frequencies, that's probably a good thing, right? And I would say that's not an unreasonable argument. But as I said, when you have a bunch of things changing all at once, it's very difficult to parse out what are the big rocks. So is it machines? Is it anabolic steroids? Some things became very obvious. Is it isometrics? Those came out right around the same time as anabolic steroids, and folks in the York camp were saying, hey, we're doing isometrics and we're getting really strong. And it's like, and you're also starting to take anabolic steroids. Some things just don't survive, like isometrics. They haven't survived in the bodybuilding community. And I think when the effect is so obvious of one versus the other, certain things will just not make the cut. But I would say frequency, like we talked about, it's such a conditionally important variable that, if you go to a low frequency program, but you start anabolic steroids, it's not like the signal to noise ratio is going to be so high that, oh my God, he dropped my frequency. And that's way worse. Like, no, the anabolic steroids are going to overcome that. The difference is, this is an important point too. Going on a 1 times per week bro split is absolutely not a deal breaker. You can make fantastic gains. It might just be slightly less effective. It's not like you shrink, So I would say arguably having just a more specialized focus in your training in general, regardless of the frequency, doing things where you can isolate certain muscle groups and you're not forced into certain free weight exercises, using anabolic steroids, and having the structure of competition change so that you are only going to be competing in strength sports. You don't have the opportunity, bodybuilding. So you don't have the opportunity cost of also trying to concurrently train for a strength sport. I think it resulted in bodybuilders being the biggest.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that everything they're doing is exactly what's optimal. I think, there's a saying, success leaves clues. That saying is not, success tells you exactly what to do, right? For every Instagram influencer or Mr. Olympia who has an incredible physique and does a specific program, there are thousands of followers who do exactly that, or their best approximation from what information they can find online, mimicking it. Yet only the Mr. Olympia is Mr. Olympia. Only the Instagram influencer is the one with 500,000 followers.
Yeah.
So if you tell me, hey, there's a program that thousands of people do and one has amazing success, I'd say that's a pretty shitty program. That's one way to look at it. But really, it's just saying, hey, individuals need individualized programs, especially at a higher level. So what we do know is that if something has survived some approach, a variable, whether that is anabolic steroids, or whether that is a frequency or whatever, and it is not, and people who are at the highest level are all doing it, we know at the very least it is not preventing high performance. It's not a deal breaker. So obviously you can get fantastic results with a very low frequency per body part, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't have some advantage from doing a higher frequency. It just means that it's not going to be the holy grail of training.
We include everyone in our discussion in these Iron Culture episodes. And thank you for that response, because I do want to have a robust conversation. Individuals that tune into these episodes, that watch the YouTube videos, they're probably already pretty well informed as to your opinions, the information, the science, just providing a little context, the explanations, someone that might be tuning in randomly. But wait a second, I saw this bodybuilder that's doing something in direct contrast to what we're about to say as it relates to frequency and how to apply it. I think another route that I'd want to go into before we talk about the applicability of frequency or how to manipulate that variable to yield the most optimal results would be then a discussion, perhaps mechanistically, as to why higher frequency when other variables are controlled seems to be a decent idea. And would some of those be higher rep quality? So to use the example, if you train 3 times per week versus 6 times per week, and you have volumes equated, and let's say you're doing 10 sets of 10 on every single day for 3 times a week, and you do 5 sets of 10, your first 5 sets, because you're training now 6 times per week, you could focus on that higher rep quality where you're not as fatigued per session. So you go in, however long the training session might take, you're able to focus. After that period of time, you complete your workout, cool, and you go home, as opposed to having a longer workout session. Would higher quality reps be maybe one of the potential mechanisms? And then can we also perhaps talk about, as it relates to strength, because I have thought a little bit more frequency in my head as it relates to strength, just personally for some of the goals I have. Not that that's the explanation, but how I personally view it. One of the other ones would perhaps be keeping rep velocity higher, where once again, as fatigue is managed, or in that individual session, you're just more fresh because you're doing less total repetitions. You can apply greater quality to those repetitions. And then I suppose maybe one of the other ones, and I'll let you answer all these, this depends upon training age, and that's another important consideration. But motor learning, right? So an individual that wants to become more proficient, and that depends. If you're an advanced lifter, if you're someone who's been lifting for 10 years, the concept of ingraining better patterns is pretty much non-existent at that point. But depending upon where you are, trying to get stronger, learning and practicing that movement more often versus just practicing it 3 times per week, even though it's the same amount of time, having it spread out so you can focus once again on the quality of those repetitions, if that matters at all. So what would be some of the mechanisms then, Eric, that explain the potential superiority of frequency or higher frequency?
Yeah. I love the way you frame that, because it kind of comes down to some of the distinctions between the foci of what people who are trying to achieve high levels of strength and high levels of muscle size kind of focus on, right? Mm-hmm. So in the bodybuilding community, fatigue has a very interesting kind of mixed role. So bodybuilders will chase fatigue inter-session. They will be doing things like drop sets, failure, pre-exhaust. So there is a time and a place and a context where fatigue is seen as a good thing. However, when you're talking about once that session is over, it's all about recovery. I need to eat every 3 hours. I don't want to be catabolic. I don't want to get too little sleep. I want to make sure that I'm taking recovery supplements. Should I be doing X, Y, Z? It's all about kind of like the way a farmer views things. Like I need to create this perfect environment to grow this muscle, right? So I think that's largely an accurate view of things. But intra-session, there are different potential sources of fatigue that we generally in the sports science community would classify under central or systemic fatigue, and then peripheral fatigue or local fatigue, which is occurring kind of in the local tissue being trained. Now, that is a semi-inaccurate model of looking at it, and as we've said before on this podcast, all models are wrong, but some models are useful.
Right.
To quote a great statistician, because if you induce enough peripheral fatigue, it will create a feedback loop to induce central fatigue. Like, for example, if you deplete glycogen in a major muscle group, it'll actually result in a decrease in global force output, centrally mediated. So you can induce enough peripheral fatigue to cause central fatigue. And sometimes they just occur concurrently. However, when you're doing like isolation movements for like your biceps, that's probably less of a concern, just to give an example, right? So there's nothing wrong, and it's actually a good thing with generating local fatigue in a given muscle group, because as that fatigue occurs and as you have trouble recruiting certain fibers, and as those fibers fail, other ones have to come in. So there are multiple ways to recruit, train, and then long-term hypertrophy, high threshold motor units and their associated muscle fibers. One is just to lift heavy, but then it's difficult to get enough volume to produce the training effect. You get the recruitment on the front end quite easily. Another way is to go to failure, which eventually ensures everything has been trained. However, that induces greater muscle damage, force you to do more total reps, and creates more central potential fatigue depending on the movement. Maybe expose you to more injury risk depending on the movement, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And another one is to do high velocity work. However, then you're only getting kind of a flicker of the high threshold motor units being turned on, and it's more about producing high power outputs, and they're not getting this sustained tension on the muscle fibers. So in the end, it comes down to, do you do moderate to high reps close to failure, or somewhere in that range? You have to have a decent proximity to failure. And there's other ways to get there. You can do multiple sets to have this kind of cumulative fatigue result in higher threshold motor units getting recruited set to set. But the problem is that if you do too many of these kind of fatigue dominant approaches to training in combination with especially compound movements that require a lot of focus, a lot of neuromuscular coordination, intra and inter, and if you have to generate a lot of metabolic output, like doing high rep squats or high rep deadlifts or supersetting 2 pressing or 2 pushing or 2 leg movements, you can induce central fatigue when you do not want central fatigue. So while local fatigue can be helpful and recruit more muscle, central fatigue is essentially not allowing you to turn on anything, because it's coming from the central nervous system. So that means you might be hitting failure, but there's a lot of quiescent fibers that are not actually being turned on, and they are just chilling, but you can't activate them. So some of the approaches that are out there, I think, emphasize these quote-unquote intensity techniques or advanced techniques too much, or in combination with the wrong exercises. So like in general, like if you've read some of my stuff, I recommend being a little bit short of failure on big compound full body movements, not supersetting them with things, generally taking longer rest periods. And then sure, if you want to go to failure on a lateral raise, a calf raise, a bicep curl, tricep push down, and you want
Coach,
to...
What's that second one you said? Second movement?
A calf raise. I mean, you might not be familiar with it. That's okay. It's for the other members of the cult. You don't have to... That's part of the pantheon you ignore, but that's all right.
Right. Continue.
It's okay. All good. Yeah. So any of these exercises that don't generate large amounts of central fatigue, you can absolutely go to the house on, and that's fine. But that's not going to be the bulk of your programming for the most part. So to kind of get back to your original question, to kind of follow it full circle, some of the mechanisms by which a high frequency program can be helpful is that it can help you avoid some of that central fatigue. And like you said, if you're doing, say, 10 by 10 on squats and bench press, you have to imagine that you're going to be getting some central fatigue from that is going to be preventing, at least as the theory, from you to really getting maximal activation. So from the performance side, it's very obvious. If you do that much work, since strength is a skill always expressed through a movement, It's kind of like cramming for a test. The quality of that study gets progressively worse. Probably better if you just started studying a week prior instead of a day prior for your test, which every college student is laughing about right now, thinking about it, but they never do it. And then, likewise for hypertrophy. So for the strength side, it's obvious, right? You want to preserve performance. Whatever setup of training that results in the best performance in session is probably going to result in the best performance on the platform over time. For hypertrophy, it's less obvious because fatigue is a good or bad thing depending on the condition. But if we think about wanting to avoid central fatigue, that's when it starts to make sense to go, all right, well, if I have a lot of these compound movements, which are really useful from a efficiency standpoint, like I do one set of deadlifts or one set of squats or one set of rows or presses, and I'm training a whole lot of muscle groups at once. However, that means that enhanced efficiency of training muscle groups at the same time is also producing more fatigue. That's when it starts to make more sense. Yeah. Maybe I should not do so much that I blow myself up so that the rest of the session doesn't go in the toilet. And maybe that'll allow me to get, 8 hours of sleep, 5 more meals in before I then train again. And hey, even tomorrow I can do some more squats, bench, or deadlifts. And that's where you typically, when people start to look at you like you're crazy, when you're talking to a bodybuilder and you say, yeah, how do you train your back 2 days in a row? It's because train your back to them means destroy my back and make it so that it won't recover for multiple days. And that may or may not be the case. And there's probably some sweet spot for each person, movement, training style, and even what they like, which we can't deny. You can still leverage that kind of desire to make each session hard, but not make it so ridiculously hard that you're forced to only train each muscle group once per week, and be able to find probably a better approach to where you can get more total work within a given unit of time. And that's really what frequency is about. It's taking a look at the requisite amount of volume and the requisite intensity that you need on all the different movements, both proximity to failure and load, to help you reach your goals, and then figuring out what's the best distribution over a microcycle that will allow me to get the most out of that. And that's actually largely manipulating the recovery side of it, And the only counter arguments against that will be, well, is there a minimum threshold for the amount of work I have to do on any given day? And there probably isn't, but there are some practical limitations. Like if you only come in and do a single set for a single exercise for a single, muscle group, from a hypertrophy perspective, not say like the Bulgarian method where you get all these buildups to then, one heavy single. That's different because you get a lot of practice and a very specific skill. But from a bodybuilding perspective, doing one set of 10 on rows, you might not quite get the right groove, a good mind-muscle connection. You might not be fully warmed up. And I could see there being a problem with being too low volume. And also, if you're only doing one set, even if you train every day, that's only 7 total sets per muscle group. So as far as what we think is an appropriate volume for most people over the course of a week, and some of the practical considerations of doing a really high frequency and therefore very low volume program, it probably means, that there is an effective functional minimum that you would do per session. But there's no mechanistic reason that you need to have a minimum amount of volume per session. So anyway, what this all results in is that you could train muscle groups anywhere from 2 to 6 times per week, I would say, and without issue, maybe even every day, depending on the muscle group.
Everyone right now is privileged to be hearing Eric speak under peak Helms situation. For those that were unaware, I mean, we did note that you competed in bodybuilding, won the River City Royal Rumble 2019 Classic. Okay, you are the champion. No, but you did fantastic. And now, after losing 19 pounds, not nearly in contest shape, I've not undergone the level of the rest that you did preparing for your show, but to be able to come on Iron Culture every week and still do an episode leading up and through your competitions was very impressive. But now that you're a well-fed boy, you're competing in strongman, it's just you're on another level here, and you actually anticipated, which is why this podcast I wanted to bring up in particular, and not just to name names. Mike Israetel, I think at EPC, was it the European Powerlifting Conference, or was it the evidence based? Which one was it, Eric?
Well, we were at both. We were both
Yeah.
at the UEBC and EPC.
The discussion that I heard where you brought that up, people, when they hear, okay, you could train full body, like their mind's blown. And I remember even in Sacramento, when we met up in July and Sound Mike was there, Alan Thrall, and they just asked, oh, what are you going to train today? And you said full body. And they kind of, not that they were shocked, oh, you're training full body, but the concept of a natural bodybuilder training full body as a means to achieve the progress that you wanted just seemed not counterintuitive, but unusual. And so the question becomes, and you answered it, but I want to explore it a little bit more, that some individuals might make that argument that there's not enough total volume in a single session, sometimes when you spread it out over such a high frequency, to induce hypertrophy. Can you just give a little bit more commentary as it relates to that specifically for those individuals? Because right now, this is we're selling you guys, I'm joking when I say this, on potentially selecting a higher frequency. It depends, but there's a lot of initial objections we have to overcome. So what about the big bodybuilders, bro? What about this? What about that? It's like, what about, Eric, then the concept that you need a minimum amount of sets in a single session to induce hypertrophy, and so if you spread it out too much, you're not getting that minimum effective dose? And can we try and quantify that, where you said, of course, rationalizing it, it made a lot of sense. If you do a single set, well, one, if you do a single set every day, that's only 7 total sets. That's not enough for hypertrophy. But also the concept of warming yourself up, and as it relates to the Bulgarian style, that's something completely different. Is there such a thing as a minimum amount of volume for a muscle group that must be trained, in your opinion, if you're approaching a higher frequency split?
This is an interesting question because you have to look at it in context to the training age of the individual.
Right.
So if you look at largely untrained or just minimally trained individuals, and you look at, that's what we've largely studied in exercise science, unfortunately, by far and away, the first set done, and these almost always sets to failure. Like if you look at single set programs versus multi-set programs, which are largely done in slightly trained or untrained individuals, yes, multi-set programs typically beat the single set. But man, the difference is not as large as you'd think. You get arguably in a novice 50% to maybe 2/3 or even 3/4 of the potential hypertrophy out of doing a single set for a muscle group to failure as you would to doing 5 sets. So there's clearly diminishing returns here. This is why when I talk to, say, like a family member of mine who wants to get serious and go to the gym, who's pressed for time, if I can get them, if they don't like lifting, it's a different ballgame if they actually enjoy something and I can get them to do more of that, because then it has multiple benefits. But if it's simply, hey, I want to develop a habit, I'm not a huge fan of exercise, but I know I should do it, how should I start? You want to set the bar low so it doesn't feel like it's difficult for them to do. And go, hey, do that machine circuit, do a warm-up on each one to get a feel for the movement, and then select a load, and I want you to go to true failure, or as close to it as you feel comfortable doing, between, say, 6 to 20 in reps, and then go to the next machine. The whole workout will take you 15 to 20 minutes. Can you find that on your lunch break, to do that twice per week, So I'm asking someone to commit 30 minutes a week to training, because I know that just doing a single set to failure on each one of those machines, even though they're machines, they're not free weights. Like, I'm breaking every rule of the iron game here. Right. I'm telling them the most suboptimal program. But you forget that for someone like that, it's not about what is optimal. It's about what will they do. So I'm trying to find the perfect combination of minimal investment of effort to get the maximal outcome. And that is absolutely a single set to failure per muscle group. So in a novice, man, absolutely, that first set is going to get you everything. But if you take an advanced lifter, someone like, let's say you or I, if we were just to do a single set to failure for each muscle group, it would be an incredibly effective maintenance stimulus.
Yeah.
We would be surprised. People would be surprised at how much strength we maintained, and we would definitely get smaller, but not as small as people would fear.
Right.
And so for us, just because essentially the bar has been pushed higher, yes, the muscle, because you're always talking about progressive overload from a place, like the word progressive means it has to do directly relevant to where you were. So if we were to become astronauts, which we could easily do because of our amazing physical profile, and we would leave the planet, mm-hmm. and we would start to shrink because of not being in a gravity well. And then we would land back on the planet and we would start to grow. So it's always relative to what our body's been exposed to. So a single set program is enough to make people who are just walking around on planet Earth grow. If they're walking around on let's say a different planet that had 2 or 3 times the gravity, and they went to a place that had 1 times the gravity and lifted weights, they'd probably shrink, you know? So it's all relative to where you've been. So if you take a trained lifter on planet Earth who's been, you know, lifting hardcore and serious with high volumes, a single set program is not enough to maintain where they're at, or maybe it's close to enough to maintain it. So yeah, there becomes a time point where you have to have a total aggregate volume over time to induce hypertrophy. But there's no reason it has to be in the form of sets in a given workout. Like, this is just the way we've constructed the way we train, you know? Obviously, we're under a constant stimulus of tension from being on planet Earth, you know? So it's just ramped up or ramped down, and there are times it will, you know, reach a threshold to create a signaling cascade that results in hypertrophy. But there's no reason to assume that our physiology follows the precepts that we developed sometime in the 1700s or 1800s of sets, reps, and are you in a gym, you know? So I think from a practical standpoint, yes, there is a kind of a functional minimum threshold for volume to induce progress. But I think it really comes down to, all right, how much total work do we need to do? And then once we figure that out, then we apply it to the practical limitations of how often we go to the gym, how long do we need to be in there for, et cetera, et cetera. How do I need to warm up? What are the movement constraints, et cetera? So I think from a practical standpoint, what do you need to do? You need to look at what's the total amount of volume I need to do to progress, either in strength or size. And then, all right, what's my available schedule for when I can get to the gym and for how long? And then think, how would I distribute this volume in the way that allows me to get the most bang for my buck in terms of recovery and stimulus, and that I'll enjoy? And that's that last piece. I don't want to try to rob the bodybuilding community of their enjoyment of hard work. So I do think there's a time and a place to, like, for example, I absolutely will take sets to failure that are later in the workout versus earlier, because I enjoy it. You know, I like to work hard, and I like to know that I've done enough work to produce hypertrophy. It gives me a sense of confidence, enjoyment, and just kind of going back to my roots. But I'm not going to do that on squats if it's my first exercise in the training session. So I think it really just comes down to changing our entire paradigm view. So the reason I get pushback when I talk about full body and those reactions that you described occur is because when I say full body, I mean one thing, and the person I'm talking to hears something else. So most people, when you say full body, they think about training each muscle group every time you step in the gym. And for me, full body is not the greatest description of what I'm doing, because I don't necessarily train my quads every single session. Like, for example, the last workout I did hamstring curls, and then everything else was largely upper body work. And then one, I did like a kind of a full body movement, like a clean press, right? Obviously a clean is not for a given muscle group. So yeah, that's full body, but did I train my calves and my quads? Not much, if at all, right? So it's more so that the paradigm shift is, instead of looking at splits of training muscle groups, you simply think about distribution of training stress in a more global perspective. And that's hard to make that shift. And you have to kind of let go of some of the schemas. And this goes back to our whole conversation that we had with Chip Conrad. And he said, you know, the way that we present fitness information now is as though it is a product. And a product is packaged, and it all comes together. You know, if you buy a packaged product, you don't get to pick and choose what you have. So when you hear the word full body, and I know that 90% of the bodybuilders out there are going to think that I'm doing at least 3 sets per muscle group, that I've got a calf raise every time I train, I've got a quad exercise every time I train, I've got a glute ham, I've got a delt, I've got a chest, I've got a back, I've got a bicep, and I've got a tricep. They all have to be done, and they're all going to be at least 3 sets. I have to accept that when I say the word full body, that is what people are buying. And what I'm asking people to do is step away from that perspective and go, right, frequency is a tool to organize volume and intensity, and there are no constraints on that. You simply look at your microcycle as a whole and go, what do I need to get done? What's the best way to distribute it? Without thinking there are rules to what I'm allowed to do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, but rather what makes sense. Like if I know in the week I need to get a total of 15 sets of chest, And if I do too much bench press, it irritates my pec minor or my AC joint. Okay, I'm only going to do 6 total sets of bench. I'm going to put them further apart in the week. I'll do that on Monday and Friday. But then I'm going to do some incline flies, some dips, and let's say I'm going to put those around. Like, okay, do I want to do my flies the day after bench? Well, only if it's the bench day where I don't do a lot of volume, because I have one heavy bench day. I do three sets of 5. I don't really get sore after that. Okay, I can do my flies there. That's the way to think of it, instead of not allowed to train chest 2 days in a row. Or I must bench every time because that's what my focus is, even though that'll hurt my AC joint, right?
What's very interesting, I would make the argument also that people have prior associations, as you're saying, like Chip Conrad stated, as it relates to certain phrases. You hear body part, it's synonymous with bodybuilding. You think full body, and the average lifter might think beginner. Where it's like, oh, full body is something that you set someone up with when they begin. And then if you were to ask a powerlifter the way they organize their training, where specificity is very important, they wouldn't say full body, but based exactly on your description, their ass is training full body. They would say, oh, it's SBD day. I'm like, well, what does SBD mean? That means full body. And what I like, Eric, is you don't know this, my man, but you're a jazz musician, because it's the openness of exploration, improvisation, and the possibilities. I've been playing a lot of music lately, so honestly, music's on my mind, Stevie Wonder style. But it's the truth that most people don't realize that classical structures in music, there's melodic, harmonic, and rhythmic considerations as it relates to any type of music. But classical actually had some very rigid structures you had to follow, rhythmic considerations that you could and could not do, even melodic progressions. And then jazz kind of opened things up, where, as Wayne Shorter says, I dare you is one of the things that's synonymous with jazz. So the ability to manipulate all those variables, if we take a look at volume, frequency, and intensity, it's kind of like melody, harmony, and rhythm, where it's how you organize it and you write ultimately your own composition, your own song, which is your training. Now, with that being said, Eric, I think it's very interesting what you said, and I had an epiphany myself that actually, confession time, I've been training full body. I made a video on this recently. Through you, I realized I've been training full body for the last 2 years. But if I was to self-identify, I would not say that I trained full body, maybe because I had that prior association, or also, as you said, in the context of how we would assume full body would be, that, oh, well, I didn't hit up my quads in this particular day, therefore, I didn't train full body. But naturally, I kind of self-organize with my strength training, where on Monday would be my, in quotations, lower body training session. But then afterwards, I would finish up with an overhead press and an incline bench. But I looked at it in my head as lower body plus some just extra upper body. It wasn't full body. It was lower body with the addition of, and then when I trained this past year, and I was on a high frequency squat program that I designed for myself 4 times per week, I would say once again, what was the split? Oh, it's like push, pull legs. It's like, but yeah, you're doing the bench press on Wednesday. You're doing your upper body. So you're doing push and pull, but then you're also squatting on that day. So how can you not define that as full body? I'm like, whoa, there's an emphasis on one muscle group. So sometimes inadvertently we could adhere to some of these rigid structures, whether we know it or not. And as you said, what I really like is that these are all tools, organization tools that we can use as it relates to our training to achieve the goals that we want. And I think maybe us having lifted for a long period of time, what individuals may note is that as you continue to train, and maybe volume being one of the key drivers of hypertrophy, as we self-organize our training, you'll notice that some individuals tend to favor, for a variety of reasons, a training at a higher frequency, or training body parts at a higher frequency. And I could say for myself, and there's so many different ways we could tackle this, is that fat loss recently, I have gone even further, full tilt into full body. And that is because for myself personally, what I found is that as I get more and more fatigued, I've done a 3-2-3-2-3-2 split. So it's been 15 weeks, actually 13 weeks. The 2 weeks of maintenance is coming up, but I've lost about 18 pounds. And what I would notice is that in a single session, I would only have so much energy for a particular body part. Where if I was to do my traditional way of training by, exercise 3, 4, 5, the actual quality of my training would go down where I wouldn't be able, I would run out
Mm.
of steam. I just feel it. I'm trying and I really am applying. And if someone was to say, yo, man, like, train to failure or train as hard as you can, I would. But just even that mind muscle connection, the feeling of the contraction, my commitment to that particular muscle group would wane. And so I found myself shifting more towards full body training where I would train once again, kind of a squat, bench, a deadlift, or some sort of variation in the same movement. And then seeing you in the middle of contest prep doing the same thing before kind of served as that inspiration. And I guess the question now that we've overcome all the objections, I'm in, okay? You just deserved a couple sandwiches for everything that you just said. Buy yourself a couple sandwiches, Eric, okay? You're back on
Thank you.
that. You did it, bro. You did it. Now that we've overcome those initial objections, let's talk about the individual, how we organize training and
Mm.
how we use frequency as one of those tools. So let's make a couple assumptions here. Okay, let's break one of the rules. Let's make some assumptions. And that is that an individual has a pretty free schedule. So I'm not saying they could train 7 times per week, but let's assume if you're part of the iron culture, you like training, right? So as you eloquently said, an individual that has no business training, that doesn't want to train, that basically just wants to look good, but doesn't enjoy the actual process, they're different. This is the cult right now. People that like training, that maybe have a certain amount of lifting under their belt. So let's say at least a year of lifting, and that they're kind of like ourselves, where they're purveyors of good times, where they like to get stronger, they like to also get bigger, and maybe they want to do those things concurrently. For an individual that is willing to dedicate as much time as possible towards their goal, that is not a complete novice, and someone who has that level of dedication both towards hypertrophy and strength, how do we start organizing some of these variables, in particular frequency?
I love the way you frame that question, because I think the biggest difficulty we run into with this is that constraints are both limiting and useful, right? So we can just see this linguistically, where the inability to talk about this, because full body is not an apt description of what we're both doing. It is basically saying that we organize our training based on the most optimal way of distributing volume and intensity. That's too long, and it is, yeah, like you said, it's a more accurate description to say I'm doing upper body with squats, even though that could be argued to be full body.
Yep.
But then someone could argue, well, you didn't do calf raises, so it's not. So I get it. There is a mismatch between what we're trying to convey and the available language for it. That's an example where the constraints are limiting. But outside of linguistics, constraints can be freeing if you believe in certain rules that are preventing you from observing what's best for you. So, for example, I'll use a personal example. I realized sometime around 2011 that I required way less volume for my legs to grow, my squat and my deadlift to progress, than I did for my bench and my upper body to progress. And I only broke a 7-year bench plateau from benching every time I stepped in the gym. So 4 to 6 times per week, high intensity, high volume to failure. And then all of a sudden I was able to find out, hey, for me, for bench press, more is more. And I went from a 315 bench press to around a 365 touch and go. And as an advanced lifter, attempting the same thing on squats and deadlifts or the Olympic lifts simply required surgery. So that was not
Minor learning experience, Eric.
Yeah. One is a 365 bench, the other one's FAI surgery. So the not the same response. And so this is an example where, because I let go of the constraints, I learned some very useful things about myself. Because none of us. Maybe not none of us. It's a very low probability that you are the perfect mean. Because when we look at, like when I write a book, I am forced to make different decisions than when I sit down with a client and train them. When I work with a client, I am trying to figure out what is best for them. When I write a book, I'm trying to figure out what is best for the largest proportion of people that are going to read the book and the least likely to cause any problems for people. So you automatically have to make concessions when you distribute knowledge to a larger group. So I'm more likely to rely on studies and talk about the average. And I'm going to have to, if I want to do a good job, write a longer book and then talk about if-then statements and give people the tools to do what I do with the client, to tease out what those individual differences are. So while the majority of people cluster around the mean and are within 1 to 2 standard deviations of it, in one area or another, they're going to be misrepresented by the mean. And that means, for example, well, if you looked at my total volume that I need to do, I'm pretty normal, 10 to 20 sets. However, it's more like 10 sets for my lower body and 20 sets for my upper body to where I start making progress. So that means that when I understand those individual constraints for me, it's helpful in that I can then start constructing a program that makes sense. And most of my quote unquote full body days, because of that unique aspect of what is Eric Helms, in combination with what my goals are, means that I do a very low volume, kind of one movement per session, lower body approach, and then a crap ton upper body every day, and that produces a more symmetrical physique and better strength outcomes in my lower body lifts. But how do you know that? You can only know that if you can start to get reliable observations of yourself. And you can only get reliable observations of yourself when you start to experiment outside of the preconceived requirements that are upon us. So if you have never played with a higher frequency than twice per week and you are plateaued, maybe it's time to try it. If you find certain lifts plateau and other ones don't, but you've never played with a higher frequency, maybe it's time to play with it. And then you'll learn, okay, well, when I go higher frequency on squats, it forces me to manipulate my frequency on deadlift in this way, or do less accessories, or train fewer sets per session, or whatever. So essentially, the constraints are what we help novices and intermediates understand how to initially organize their training. But eventually they become limiting factors to where you are now unable to progress past the intermediate phase because you haven't figured out how you are actually not a mean. And we know from actual research and experience as coaches, and I'm sure Omar would back this up, if you take a novice, someone who's never lifted before, pretty much anything that is not absolutely dumb will work well. Yeah. Any training approach. And it might even produce maximal gains, whether it's a 5-3-1, a 5x5, German volume training, whatever. They're going to get maximal gains. And then you reach a point where to break that plateau, that's where you have to start figuring out what's best for you. So I'm going to give the constraints that are best for most. Yeah. And I would say, all right, given the kind of the setup that you gave me, that underhand slow pitch, I'm going to try to knock this out of the park. First thing is, I would say for almost everyone, you want to try to find a way to be training each muscle group more than once per week. The only time that training a muscle group once per week makes sense is when you're doing so much intensity or volume in a single session that it forces you to do that. And I think that's almost inherently so optimal. The only other time where I think training something once per week makes sense is when you have a joint issue or a scheduling issue to where you can only get in the gym maybe once or twice per week, or like you must squat, bench, or deadlift because you're competing in powerlifting. But every time you squat, bench, or deadlift, regardless of the volume, it causes a lot of joint stress that takes longer to recover from than, say, your muscle might. But for someone who is not forced to do certain movements, if that was you, I would just say, don't do those movements. It's other ways to make your body grow. And there's other ways to build strength if you're not actually competing in them. So with that said, I would say you want to start with I'm going to hit everything at least twice per week. And then I'm going to assess what's the appropriate volume. For most people, I think starting at, 10 sets per muscle group, including both compound and isolations, it's a decent place to start. And then from there, the world is your oyster. I think you need to look at what is the number of times I can get to the gym reliably that I enjoy that isn't a schedule strain, and then figure it out from there. If that's twice per week, you're probably going to do 2 full body sessions. If that's 3 times per week, that could be an upper, lower, and then a full. If that is 4 times per week, you get a little more play. You can do upper, lower, or you could do 4 full body sessions, some being more upper body dominant, some being more lower body dominant, and you get to spread out those 10 plus sets over each one. So I think if you land in the range of 10 to 20 sets per muscle group, if you're training each muscle group twice per week, and that if you understand that when you do a higher frequency per muscle group or per movement, that you need to be more attentive to, especially on compound movements, the proximity to failure and the total volume per session, that you need to limit one, the other, or both if you're going to do something back to back, then you can play with these full body sessions. And it's very much worth experimenting. So I took about a full year 6 months playing with upper lower, and then 6 months playing with different organizations of what we're calling full body, which really just means in my case upper body every time, and then 1 or 2 lower body movements. And sometimes that might just be a hamstring curl or just be a calf raise, and then seeing what movements require more recovery, which movements really tank the rest of my session, what's the appropriate rep range and RPE range, because those interact as well with how I distribute this this total training stress. That's when you really get to start to play with it, and each training cycle then becomes a opportunity to fine tune that and to make it more and more inherently customized. So I think that's actually quite fun, but it can be very overwhelming for someone who's new to the game. And there might be some inefficiencies from trial and error that you could simply avoid by using some kind of program that fits within these broad constraints. So for example, like if I was just going to take a random intermediate off the street who had this very scared look in his eyes or her eyes when I started to describe how, hey, you can train however you want. They're like, oh my God, I need structure. I would say, all right, do 5-3-1. And then on your squat day, I want you to do bench as well for an accessory movement. And on your deadlift day, I want you to do overhead press as well as an accessory movement. And then on 2 days per week, also do some back work. And be like, okay, cool. Now you've got structure. You're training every single one of the lifts twice per week. Oh, sorry. And also you also do on your overhead press day, you do deadlift. And on your bench day, you do squats. And just make the second squat and the second deadlift day where you're not doing the main work submaximal and lower volume. And all of a sudden, you've got like an easy and a hard day on squat. You've got an easy and a hard day on deadlift. And you've got 2 sessions overhead press, 2 sessions bench, and you're doing back work twice per week. Look at that. You just took a structured program with some main lifts, some accessory movements. You're training everything twice per week. And you'll also find that gets you to roughly that 10 sets per muscle group per week. Natural progression built in, 4th week deload, boom. Run that and then see how you go. And you'll find that maybe certain movements respond well to that. Certain movements don't. Maybe you can't handle that frequency on squat and deadlifts, or maybe you find you get an immediate bump up in bench, but then plateau, but you're still well recovered, and that gives you clues that maybe I should be doing bench on 3 days per week. That's kind of almost exactly my story. I started going to 2 hard deadlift sessions per week. My deadlift kind of faltered and stuttered, and I found that if I'm going to train deadlift at the higher frequency, I need to moderate the intensity or the difficulty per session. And then when I went from training bench once per week to twice per week, I had an immediate bump, then a plateau. When I went from 2 times per week to 3 times per week, I had another bump, then a plateau. And then I finally went, you know what? If I'm training, I'm benching. And that's when I had that full year of progress and hit that 365, or 363, I should say. 165 kilo bench press.
Why do people, Eric?
It's again, we're limited by these systems. The metric system and pounds, they just don't convert perfectly. Everything is lost in translation.
I love how you said snatch an intermediate off the street if I was to approach one. It's a great phrase. And the need for structure sometimes can be a crutch for those that don't understand that chaos is under everything around us. And sometimes you need to thrive in that chaos. My advice, and you hinted at it essentially, if someone feels overwhelmed, which I don't think they would be listening to this episode on frequency, but wondering,
Omar, can I ask you a question real quick?
Shoot, bro.
And this may end up not proving my point at all, and then it's just an interesting learning for me. So,
yeah,
most jazz musicians, would you say they started with jazz, or they came to jazz from another discipline first?
That really, really depends. I would actually say it'd be time period specific, because jazz used to be a lot more popular. So if we're talking in the 1920s, 1930s, someone like Charlie Parker, it would definitely be jazz being the original base. These days, I would say that it's likely someone probably hears popular music first. So they might want to, play Elton John, and then they gravitate towards jazz. So sorry for giving you a shitty answer, but yeah.
So not a perfect analogy. The analogy everyone will understand, though, is that chess is an inherently harder game to learn than checkers.
Sure.
Very, very similar, though. They use the same board. And, to someone who's not familiar with games, you wouldn't be able to tell if someone's playing chess or checkers because you maybe don't know the pieces, right?
Yep.
So we all kind of start playing checkers when it comes to training. And if you told someone, oh, hey, by the way, every single one of those pieces, they can actually move differently. And only if you don't actually kill the king, you don't jump it. You just get to a position where you could jump it. That's how you win. And they're like, all right, like I can't remember all this. Let me get a book. People don't write books on checkers training that are 500 pages long. It didn't take us from the 70s until the 90s to develop a algorithm that could beat a human.
Right.
Big blue, I think it was, yeah, in checkers. That checkers is much simpler.
Yeah.
So starting with checkers is the reality for everyone. And I know that saying, hey, training is actually like chess. There's almost infinite manipulations and customizations, and there's going to be a different game for every single person. Is not necessarily something that make people go, oh, great, that's so helpful. So I do recommend you start with checkers. You find a program that gets you some constraints and it makes sense. But like Omar's saying, if you really want to know that the truth is that something optimal for you is not going to be represented by some cookie cutter program, and that's going to require paying attention, time, and experimentation.
See, it's so funny. I wanted to give an exact answer. I would broadly agree with that, though, as it honestly even relates to jazz. The only reason I said that, which is the truth, that musical intelligence actually over time, due to what is defined as being popular music, has gone down. Meaning that jazz was the popular standard. If you look at, and you can look at the statistics of record sales, jazz was at the top when it was around the bebop era, swing era, Duke Ellington, and these are far more advanced melodic harmonic considerations. And in fact, it kind of is as we say, the fitness industrial complex, Chip Conrad. It's kind of been the musical industrial complex that has purposely dumbed things down. But at the same time, even if you want to play jazz, you need to have that underlying foundation. You need to understand 1-3-5. You need to understand major minor chords. So the vast majority of people are absolutely going to start with popular music, with what they hear off the street. So the chess analogy, the jazz analogy, you're just on point, bro. Okay, as someone said months ago, like Eric needs. That's why I said that. It looks like he needs to eat a sandwich or something. Like when you're dieting hard and so forth. I'm like, buy yourself a couple sandwiches for this episode, man. You're killing it. I do think for everyone is that opportunity, and that's why when you gave that chess analogy, in order to really discover what's optimal for you. So don't be put off by that initial objection of, wait a second, I got to answer some of these questions for myself, where there's not just, again, we want the structure put out in front of us. What do I need to do top down? And as you said, individuals aren't the mean, and some people respond differently. I have found for myself, and it's been interesting manipulating those variables, where having a higher squat frequency but a lower total amount of volume per session has been exceptionally helpful for my squat. At the same time, if I'm to take that same amount of volume and just fit it into 2 sessions, I noticed my recoverability, the aches and pains I would get would be too damn high. So I was able to spread out more volume by increasing that frequency, the volume necessary for me personally to make progress. Same idea when you said the bench press. It's so weird how we do have certain similarities. So you're just hearing two guys echoing, yeah, man, like bench press. I like to bench press frequently, and it worked great for me. And overall lower body for squats, it helps. Deadlifts, I actually like a lower frequency. But once you discover that, what I was going to say, I'm actually quietly, I'm proud, and I'm also slightly jealous of my brother because, he has very similar genetics to me. And so growing up, in terms of sprinting and so forth, our times would be remarkably similar. In fact, we have this story where no one can quite remember who was faster. We're both on the track team. But no one can quite remember. And therefore, when he started lifting, knowing what I know about myself, the process of elimination, experimentation that's occurred throughout the years, he now has only been training for 18 months. He's nipping at my heels when it comes to just even certain movements where all the mistakes that I made. It's okay if I think a time-oriented approach for most individuals where we wanted our results yesterday. I could understand some of the trepidation potentially where someone's like, well, wait a second, I might try something based upon all the knowledge that I have, and it might not be best for me, and I might have to adjust it over time. That's just the reality of things. But it's really fun experimenting and ultimately finding what works for you. And when you find it, as an example of my brother, where I kind of knew intuitively, I'm like, you know what? I'm making an assumption here that likely he's going to respond relatively similar to me versus someone off the street. You said an intermediate off the street, and he's responded quite well. And then when you said, Eric, about success leaving clues, I opened up with the example of bodybuilders talking about body part training and how they train body parts less frequently than maybe what some of the literature would tend to indicate might work for the average individual. But if success indeed does leave clues, looking at the IPF, the USAPL Nationals was very recently. And if you take a look at the training that a lot of the top tier competitors, or just a lot of the people that are now lifting, doing the squat, bench, deadlift, they tend to favor a higher frequency approach. So something that is more similar. If you are a natural strength athlete, you want to take a look at perhaps also what a lot of the successful natural strength athletes are doing. And sometimes there is that mismatch where it's like, yeah, you got this super accomplished bodybuilder that maybe his program, as you said, Eric, only works for 1 in 100 people, and he's that 100th person. But for everyone else, it might not work. And he's the only one because he's the big dog, right? He or she's the big dog talking about what you should be doing. The customization, the need for individualization is so important. So I think capping off kind of the episode with a discussion, not only of frequency, but how it relates to the individual, we can't get much higher than this. In fact, there's only one way to go, my friend.
That's right. Omar and I have some similarities, so we share conclusions. Like while Wu-Tang might have the 36 chambers, Iron Culture has one chamber, and that's the echo chamber.
Yeah.
And we're here to confirm each other's biases. Yes. But in all seriousness, so this whole thing that you're talking about, Omar, like if a community of people with similar characteristics kind of groupthink lands upon a certain commonality, it's a high probability that if you start training, that's a good place to start.
Right.
Like if you are a natural powerlifter in a medium weight class, you're not super heavyweight and you're not the lightest weight class, starting with a 3 times per week bench, 2 times per week squat, 1 times per week deadlift, and doing some normal accessories kind of thing, that's probably going to be pretty close to optimal for you. At least it's a higher probability. And like you said, if you do have the benefit of a brother who has very similar genetics to you and has been able to make some success, you can kind of inherit some of those lessons and level up your rate of progress. But like Omar said, it's just simply the name of the game that if you want to unlock the furthest reaches of your potential, you're going to have to take an individualized approach. And I would say essentially there's a double-edged sword here. If you, from the very beginning, go, right, I need to find the perfect individualized approach to me, you're not going to have the skill or knowledge or even body awareness to start effectively doing that investigative journey. And you're going to be making some errors in the beginning. And likewise, if you simply just never think of yourself as an individual and just latch on to influencers and programs and athletes and follow them, you might be able to choose, that cultural meme that's closest to you from the start, and like always choosing programs that have been widely accoladed and acclaimed in a given population that represents you. You might really quickly get to a B-, but never get higher than a B or a B+. You can never get the program that really fits you like an A and be stuck there forever. So it's kind of a question of the tortoise versus the hare. And I would say that you don't have to do either one of those. You don't have to start from the beginning trying to be the individualist, and you don't have to start forever. And you don't have to remain forever as the person who's just following trends. There's a time and a place for both, and they can happen concurrently. So an example of kind of the way I operated and did this was that I was teaching myself to program, reading about periodization, educating myself, watching discussions of folks like Mike Tuchscherer online, where he was not talking about 531. But then I was also, while doing that, following template-based programs that I was only manipulating slowly or slightly, And when I very first got into it, I just kind of found a workout partner and said, I'll do what you do, So when I did not have the skill or the awareness or the knowledge or even the awareness of what to pay attention to know how to individualize my program, I went with something that was a template. And that's fine based on what we know about how beginners progress. And then I was leveling up my knowledge while sticking to kind of the safety blanket zone of what made sense. And only really got outside of that little comfort zone once I felt that I actually understood enough. And then I took my toe out, and that's when I did the kind of thing like with 531 where we talked about, where I manipulated it so that I was actually training everything twice per week. And then I actually started writing my own programs and writing programs for my clients. So it can be a concurrent development. I'm not saying you have to peel the curtain away and stare at the existential crisis of the infinity, which is life, immediately. I'm saying absolutely just follow a templated program that fits within those kind of constraints we talked about, but then also become a student of the sport and get to the point where you can develop the savvy ability to customize your training. And you know, it's kind of like another double-edged sword, and we have to acknowledge this as influencers. Omar, you and I, we're influenzas, as you like to say, is that as we spread information, we're also forcing more constraints onto people.
Yes.
So it's important to have these discussions about individualizations. People know that. Because if we go back to, say, the 20s, 30s, 40s, or even 50s, like I said, there was no World Wide Web. There was no vast spread of knowledge. People would come into a gym atmosphere and they wouldn't have access to information. And you could go, oh, that sucks. They don't have access to all this information. It does and it doesn't. It also means that when they run into a head-scratching situation, they have to solve it on their own. You know, the only resources available to them are the couple of guys who train with them with similar goals. And then they're thrown outside of that comfort zone immediately, and they have to figure out what makes sense. So they had a more rapid uptake of that self-awareness and understanding what works and what doesn't through trial and error, because all they have is a room full of equipment and maybe one or two other bodybuilders or lifters who could give them some ideas. So their initial program that might be, I don't know how to do this yet, might just be copying, the John Grimmick or the Tommy Kono or the whoever of their gym, doing that, and then finding out over time it doesn't work. And there's no other source of information. There's nobody else, So they either travel somewhere else or figure it out on their own. And that was probably suboptimal and more optimal than what we have today, because the trial and error factor would be forced rather than something that you can kind of, like I'm talking about. The ideal situation, if you want to take advantage of the 2019 reality, is find something that fits within the precepts of what we think is best for that individual, the intermediate off the street. But know that can't be perfect for you. The likelihood that 531 was perfectly built for you is unlikely. So hang out knowing that you have immediately fast-tracked yourself to a B grade, but work on getting that A, because you're worth it.
Wow. Lifting people up through lifting. I don't know if there's a higher calling. Empowering individuals. Honestly, I think ultimately that message is empowering, knowing that it's within your abilities, and everyone has that ability to figure out what ultimately would be best for them. And you can have the assistance of a coach. I'm not saying, and Eric's not saying, hey kid, you're on your own. You did a few templates. Now you're into the wide open world, and holy shit, it's terrifying. I do think there's the flip side of individuals. And again, if you're listening to Iron Culture, this is less likely. But being a young YOLO myself, at the early stages of internet lifting culture, where you'd see a lifting program and then immediately kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's like, well, wait, it's like, no, I like this. I'd customize this. I think the process now these days of following a good template, right? Honestly, any template, but a template by a qualified coach, making notes, internal notes, maybe external notes where you're writing things down, or you're just figuring out, well, how did I respond to this? Really applying yourself with those constraints, how the program's laid out. And then gradually over time, noticing some of those clues or some of those patterns of what you tend to respond better at, and then organizing from that point on would be best. But ultimately, it also is the most rewarding, because it is within your own powers. There's no one to blame. It's scary. It's terrifying. But it's also empowering that there's no one to blame other than yourself. And you don't need to go on this journey alone. That's why I was totally joking, or we're joking with, it's like, you got to do this, kid. It's a tough world. Go on from there. I think there is extreme value from having a qualified coach. And I can say that Eric has been the shining light, okay, a beacon. While I've been
a lighthouse.
A lighthouse. Not only a brick house. Not only
I'm trying to say it like a Canadian.
Oh yeah, house. You know what's funny? You actually pick up successfully, unlike a lot of people, when I say about how a Canadian would say it.
About.
Good. See, there's a few things I've internally noted about you. Many things actually, but one is
it's not just a boot.
Yeah,
that's like
your
it's
ears,
an over exaggeration.
That's what I was gonna say, man. Your ear is solid. A lot of people phonetically, when they hear that combination, they hear me say about and then they repeat it and they'll say a boot, which is completely incorrect. But you're
Mm,
dead on it as always. The beacon of light in the lighthouse, kind of like, is it a Commodore's brick house? Right? She's a brick house. That's Commodore's, right? Yeah. Oh
absolutely.
yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. That was the song you danced to on Instagram. You have guided me indirectly and directly in the past year towards conclusions that I've come to myself. And I think that's what you said. One of the roles of a coach is to try and help an individual reach their own conclusions. My journey has been assisted through the help of a coach. So I think maybe the last point I just wanted to bring up is the concept that ultimately you should learn for yourself what you need to do, but having a qualified individual can greatly shorten that time period. And that essentially is what I was saying also when it comes to my brother. My brother's a very smart individual. He's like, you know what, man, I'm going to give you the reins to handle my programming. And he's performed remarkably as a result. So you don't have to go at it alone. We're all here under the cult. And Eric actually does, once again, an excellent job. Too good of a job. I would almost put forth that, not that as a time waster, but he responds to people's comments, DMs. Holy crap. It's
A lot
impressive.
less DMs than I used to. So just I have drawn the line somewhere for my own sanity and
Right.
for the greater utility of all.
Yes. Yeah.
But yeah, no, I do want to echo that I think coaching is a really valuable thing here. That's a whole nother can of worms, a whole nother
Yeah.
podcast episode. However, if you can tell that, if you know from listening to this, you go, well, I am kind of more on that novice or early stage intermediate, spectrum. I don't quite have the skills to know how to pay attention and figure out what is the best individual approach for me. But I do want to learn, and I am going to follow a templated approach. Another option is to get the help of someone who, for a living, figures out what's the best individual approach for individuals. And then you just have to be able to identify a good versus bad coach, which in general, you want to find someone who also thinks there is an individual approach versus a coach who says, hey, all my athletes do the same thing because it's the best thing for everyone. So,
Ooh. Yeah, that's tough. I knew too many like that.
yeah.
What's interesting, just a quick note, is that unfortunately, I would say the overall fitness IQ has increased in the lifting space, and that is awesome. At the same time, I'll go on occasion to a random gym, and you hear some of the similar information being parroted because I think some information inherently is a little sexier, like the concept of, oh, you want to get a 7% body fat? I have that neat solution for you. So I think giving people the framework to understand what's going on, enabling them to make their own individual choices. Whew, that's dangerous, but it's also exciting. Is there anything, I would say, Eric, in closing, you feel that we forgot to mention or we should circle back to? We should do that 360-degree journey so we just end up right where we started. We've gone nowhere. That we should further clarify, define, explore before we wrap it up?
The only thing I want to touch on is I think we position this whole discussion around if your goal is hypertrophy or if your goal is strength. But I know there's actually, just like when the physical culture started, now we've come full circle, and especially I'm sure there's plenty of people who are represented by this from the iron culture audience might have goals of both. Both you and I have goals of both. I specifically am trying to compete in 4 different iron game sports. Not recommended, yes. Fun and exciting, yes. Potential to cause injury, absolutely. But nonetheless, I think this would not be a goal that I would know how to program for had I not gone on this long journey into self-investigation. So, for example, if you understand what principles of training can help you optimize strength under different conditions, how hypertrophy leads to strength and in what ways, and if you understand the stimulus to fatigue ratio, different movements, if you know your own recovery capabilities, and if you know the requirements of a sport, that can all come together and create an emergent approach. So for example, my quote unquote full body training approach that I took during contest prep looks very different to what I'm doing now for the goal of competing in strongman, powerlifting, and weightlifting, and not regressing or losing anything in terms of full body hypertrophy. So just as an example, if we understand that the load on the bar is going to be the closest predictive variable for what will result in greater strength, especially in someone who is a little bit detrained as far as 1RM strength, like someone who just did a bodybuilding cycle for a 9-month contest prep, then, okay, hey, I can take a very low volume approach from these very high fatiguing and high risk movements, like for strongman weightlifting and powerlifting, and just work up to a single for the squat, the bench, the deadlift, snatch, clean and jerk, log press, strongman deadlift, and then do a fair amount of bodybuilding accessory work and then some conditioning work. And that can be like my baseline program until I have regained all of the strength from those low volume singles. And then when I'm actually close enough to a competition, I can specialize for one more than the other. So that's the type of thing that I wouldn't know how to do, just to give a concrete example, if I hadn't done this kind of investigation and self-discovery and leveling up of my knowledge. So again, there's coaches for that as well. Like for example, Max Ada, I know he does a lot of super total training, coaching, and he's played with that. And there's obviously, a lot of different examples I could give of someone with concurrent strength and hypertrophy goals, maybe non-competitive, someone who just wants to be strong at the big three, but also big. That's where you go. All right. And we talked about this back when I was on your channel, back when we did the Kaizen program, how the best approach isn't necessarily just to do a crap ton of volume from the squat, bench, and the deadlift. That those are great vehicles, but they're also costly vehicles for hypertrophy. That you might want to do more specific work on the big three for strength, and then figure out what are the low joint stress and global stress accessory movements that you can use for hypertrophy. So it might be that you're doing plenty of machine and isolation work, cable work for global hypertrophy, but then you're doing strength specific work with moderate to low volume on squat, bench, and deadlift. And you can kind of take that same philosophy and then figure out what the best frequency for those lifts are, body part distribution, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, it's just something to consider, that there are lots of people out there who don't just have the goal of being a bodybuilder or a powerlifter. And that's where it gets really interesting, and where this becomes a very, very useful understanding that you are no longer constrained, because there aren't a lot of programs out there for someone who has multiple goals. So you have to actually venture into the forest if your goal is a little more complex.
I'm just, honestly, I'm relieved. I was slightly scared entering this conversation that we weren't going to reach the same conclusion that German volume training is the best. And I'm just glad that we waded through the bullshit. Okay, we weren't letting mainstream media affect our perception of things. We just went right at it, and we put on a tinfoil hat because we want to be careful of getting that radiation. And we're able to figure out logically that there is only one solution for every single person. And of course, it has to be German engineering, GVT. It has a sexy name. It has a sexy acronym. It kind of sounds foreign. It's a little mysterious. It's something you likely haven't done before. So there's the novelty approach. It just works. In fact, that probably should be the conclusion of this episode. It just works.
Enter into the iron culture chamber. It will echo, and you will be benefited.
Oh yeah. Well, what's great is there's no divergent opinion because we disagree with each other. So it's great. So we never have to face any opposition or critical thinking because we're just agreeing.
It's the beauty of being not only a big fish in a small pond, but the
only
two fish in a pond is we're always right.
And when you're right, you're right. Eric, thanks for being on. You're like, what are you talking about, man? I'm a co-host. Appreciate having you. I want to say...
I was just going to say intellect is correct and leave it at that.
Oh, inside joke. I love it. I want to thank everyone for listening to this episode. I thoroughly enjoyed, and maybe if you guys also enjoyed, leave a comment, because we want to focus on trying to get, guests on this channel, on this podcast, that can illuminate individuals that you might not have heard about. As Eric has said repeatedly, which is a great way of thinking about it, we want to get your favorite expert on this channel. But I personally thoroughly enjoy the dual episodes. So if individuals enjoy that, go ahead, leave a comment on YouTube. If you, once again, thought of yourself, at any point, you can leave a like. You can help us if you're listening on iTunes, because we haven't figured out the algorithm yet, but we are certain that leaving a rating and review on iTunes seems to assist in the rankings. Suspiciously, sometimes we'll have an episode, and I know because I look at the metrics behind the scenes, they'll do quite well, and it won't show up in the rankings. And then other times, we have an episode that does moderately well, and it shows up. So all I have to say is P90X is after us. The threat is real. Richard Simmons and his fabulous hitmen are after us. Okay, I see sparkle wherever I go, Eric, and I can't state otherwise. Leave a rating review, and we'll catch everyone on that iron culture every single Monday. Peace.